Hello and welcome back to this Revit Basics series for MEP. In the last video, we went over setting up your model, views, and sheets. In this video, we'll look at some of the more advanced design features. We'll dive into topics like setting up your model for worksharing, project phases, making alternative designs, and where you can go to find additional resources. A few disclaimers. In the interest of only showing what we believe will be useful to the most people, there are several things we will not be talking about in these videos. We're not going into great depth about architectural stuff or creating a model from scratch. It's assumed you'll be working from an architectural model that was provided. We're also not doing any really deep dives into any of these concepts. These videos are meant to be a sort of quick start guide. So if you need to dive deep into any of these concepts, there are other resources dedicated to that. Finally, we will not be doing much actual MEP stuff in these videos. I don't know what discipline you are. I don't want to show you stuff that is not relevant to your discipline. So again, there are dedicated resources you can find for that. Finally, depending on where you work and your position, you may not have the responsibility or the power to set up the features I'm about to show you. Regardless, it's good to know how they function in case you ever need to tweak things or diagnose a problem. In the previous video, we covered the basics of how to get your project set up and a bit about how to start designing in your model. But odds are you're not the only person working on this project, and there's a good chance multiple people will need to make changes to the model at the same time. That's where Revit's worksharing features come in. Before we dive into the features themselves, there are some tips and concepts to go over. First of all, if you know you want to use worksharing on the project, set it up for that as soon as possible. There's some interplay between these features and the elements in your model, and if you try to introduce worksharing partway through, you'll need to spend some time reconfiguring any elements you've already placed. Second, when using the worksharing features, you will need to talk to people. If you are part of an electrical team and two of you are trying to circuit devices to the same panel, it can cause problems. If you are a mechanical doing your HVAC design and you are swapping out AC units while the electrical designer is trying to adjust the load, it can cause problems. So talk to each other, figure out who's working where, and it will make the process go more smoothly. Now, let's do a brief conceptual overview of what happens when you're in a workshared project. When we start the process to set this project up for worksharing, we'll need to specify a location on a company server or on the Revit Worksharing cloud where the central model can be stored. That central model is your source of truth, where all information flows from and eventually goes back to. If you've ever done any coding and dealt with version control programs like Git, the central model is your main or master or trunk branch. When you open up a workshared project, you're typically not working in the central model directly. Instead, Revit creates a temporary local copy on your computer that's like a snapshot of the central model at that time. While you're working in that local copy, you can check out specific pieces or sections of the model, which means you are the only one with permission to make changes to those things you've checked out. The idea behind that is if you are the only one allowed to make changes, it won't create conflicts like I mentioned earlier. Important to note, this is a safeguard, but it is not foolproof. Make sure you're talking to other people and that you know ahead of time if you are cleared to work on something. When you've done some work and you are ready to save it, you synchronize your local copy back to the central model. Going back to that version control analogy, this is like committing your code or your branch back to the main. One benefit to having this separate step is that if you make a mistake you can't come back from, rather than syncing, you can just scrap the local copy and it will not impact your central model. Now, occasionally, mistakes will still happen. Fortunately, Revit has commands to let you see when changes have been committed, pull backups, check for conflicts, like if someone's cable tray is running straight through someone else's ductwork, and so on. We won't look deeply into those features, just know that they exist to help you correct any errors that do occur. And there are resources to learn more about those features when you need them. So, with that out of the way, let's set this project up for work sharing. To do that, go to the Collaborate ribbon. This is where all of your work sharing commands are located, and run the Collaborate command. Something to note, if you haven't yet saved your model, it will ask you to do so before continuing. If you plan on saving the model to a company network, which we're going to do first, it's best to save it to the network where you want everyone in the company to access it before you start work sharing. You can set it up for work sharing and then put it on the network, but that order of operations can get a bit complicated, and it's not something we're going to go into. When you run the command, you'll be asked whether you want to collaborate over a company network or the Revit cloud. Again, we'll look at the network option first. Press OK. Give it a minute to set up the work sharing features in the file. And that's pretty much it. You can start using work sharing features in this project. The next time we save, it will inform us that this file will become a central model, like we talked about earlier. If you haven't saved it to the network yet, this dialog warns you that it's your last chance to do so before things get complicated. If you ran the command while the project was saved on your local machine, you need to press No, go to File, Save As, Project, and save it to the network. If it's already on the network, press Yes. If we close the project, you can see in our recent files, there's a little cube icon for the project. That tells us this is a central model on a network. When we open it, it explains that we'll be working in a local copy and not in the central model itself. As I said before, that layer of separation ensures that if we make a catastrophic mistake, it only damages this temporary copy and doesn't affect what's on the network. You can see if we close without saving, it will ask how to proceed, and even gives us the option to save the local copy separately without syncing, or to scrap it entirely. Now, sometimes you may need to make changes to the central model directly. In our case, we want to move the central model from the company network to the Revit Worksharing cloud. To do that, run the Open command and select the file. Down here, we have two toggles specifically for work sharing. The Detach toggle, as the name implies, will open a local copy that is disconnected from the central model. Where this is most helpful is if someone has sent you a copy of a work shared project and you don't have access to the central model for that project. If you just try to open it, you'll get warnings that it can't find the central model, so you can't do anything because it can't sync the changes. If you create a detached copy, it doesn't look for the central model and you are free to poke around. The Create New Local toggle is what we care about for this. Uncheck this, and rather than make a local copy, it will open the central model itself. So, I'll be showing the workflow to take a project that's already shared and put it on the cloud, but the process to put it on the cloud in the first place is pretty similar. You'll run the Collaborate command. It will ask where you want to save it. You'll select the cloud, and from there, it will look exactly like this. Something important to note, access to the Revit Worksharing cloud is not included in your Revit subscription. To save to the Revit cloud, you'll need a separate Autodesk subscription. At the time of filming, it's called BIM Collaborate Pro, in addition to a few other things. We're not going to go into setting all that up because depending on where you work, it may already be set up, or it may just not be feasible for you to use this service. One last thing to note, if you're not sure whether you are set up for the Revit Worksharing cloud, The easiest way to find out is to try. If you're not, a dialog box will pop up explaining exactly which services you need but don't have linked to your Autodesk account. So, assuming your Revit Worksharing Cloud backend is already set up, when you run the Collaborate in Cloud command, or run Collaborate and select the Cloud option, it will bring up a window displaying the projects you currently have access to on the cloud. Up here, you can navigate to different projects, and this area works similar to Windows Explorer, where you can click around in different folders for the project. Select a location, give the project a name, press save, give it a minute to transmit, and you're all set. Similar to the central model on the network, when we close out, you can see a little icon indicating it is a work-shared model located in the cloud. If you open it, it will create a local copy of the model for you to work in, so changes only make it up to Central when you want them to. Another quick thing to point out, if you need to open a project on the cloud and it isn't in your recent files, rather than use the Open button, you'll go here to Autodesk Docs. From there, you can browse to the file you want to open. So, we've got a work-shared project here. What can we do that we couldn't do before? The answer will depend on your discipline and exactly how your company chooses to do things, and we're not going to cover all of them in this video because you may or may not end up using them. One feature we are going to look at is Worksets. Worksets allow you to essentially grab a group of elements and say, I'm borrowing these to work on them, the rest of you can have them back when I am finished. You can also use Worksets to tell Revit, only give me elements in this group to ensure I don't touch anything I'm not supposed to. They can also be an effective tool when printing off documentation to quickly show or hide entire swaths of the model. All that being said, let's look at how you create and use Worksets. To view and modify your Worksets, run the Worksets command. When you first enable worksharing on a project, it will make two worksets, a shared levels and grids workset and workset 1. Any levels or grids already present in the model, you guessed it, go into the shared levels and grids workset. Everything else goes to workset 1. The linked model, the spaces, those electrical devices we placed, everything. Let's start by making workset 1 editable. It won't let us actually edit anything until we refresh the dialog box, so let's close out and reopen. And now we can make changes. We'll rename this one to linked model spaces, since that's what we'll leave on that workset. Now we can make a few more. The way you separate your model will depend on your company and how you have your model set up. But most often, it's done by discipline or by subtypes within a discipline. If all of your MEP work is being done in a single file, you might have an electrical workset, a mechanical, and a plumbing. If your company splits the M, E, and P into separate files, and you'll have multiple people in the same discipline working on a file, you might define worksets more granularly. So for electrical, that could be distribution for your panels, power for your receptacles and things, and lighting. I've also seen people define worksets by the building floor or section, or some combination of that and discipline, or an entirely different scheme altogether. Some prefer to not even use worksets. It all just goes into workset 1 and that's it. The right configuration for you will depend on your situation. Now that we have our worksets defined, we can decide what elements of the model belong in which workset. Something to note, each element of a workshared model must belong to one and exactly one workset. You can't have elements that aren't in a workset or in multiple worksets. For existing elements outside of levels and grids, as I mentioned before, they are all lumped into the same work set. That's why I said it's best to enable work sharing early in the project, because to put these electrical devices on the correct work set, I would have to select them, go into Properties, and change the work set to electrical. If you've already laid out most of your design before doing your work sets, this process could take up a good chunk of your day. For new elements, you can choose beforehand which work set you want them to go into by setting the active work set. You can do that in the Worksets command, using the drop-down beside the command on the ribbon, or on the drop-down on the bottom toolbar. So we'll set that to electrical. And as you can see, when I insert this electrical equipment, it's already in the work set I want. So as long as I'm somewhat keeping track of my active work set, I don't need to keep setting that for each device I insert. I've got one other thing to show you related to work sets, but it requires closing the project. And before we do that, we need to synchronize the changes we've made with the central model. To do that, you can run the Synchronize command on the Collaborate ribbon, or you can click this cube on the bottom toolbar. Let's do a quick tour of these settings. Central model location is, of course, where the model lives that you are syncing to. For cloud models, you cannot change this. For models saved to a company network, you can browse to change the destination if needed. This checkbox to compact the central model works similar to when you put something into a zip file. It compresses the file down so it takes up less space in storage, which can also speed up accessing and syncing to the central model. As it indicates here, though, the actual process of compacting will make the sync take longer, so it's not recommended that you do this every time. This section deals with relinquishing, which we'll talk about in a moment. And finally, a little comment field so you can make a note about what changes you are sending back to the central model, in case someone needs to review that later. So for this one, we can say Configuring Worksets. Once you have your settings configured, press OK to sync. If you need to sync again later, but the settings and comment aren't changing, we also have the Sync Now command. That will just run the sync with your previous settings and save you going through the dialog box. Now we can talk about relinquishing. When you check out a work set or modify an element in the model, you are checking out that thing and saying, I'm working on this, no one else touch it until I'm finished. Once you're finished, you relinquish your hold on those things so other people can use them. As we just saw, you can relinquish them automatically when you sync. You can also do it in a separate step using the Relinquish All Mine command on the Collaborate ribbon. Not much to talk about there. If you've synced your changes, you run the command, and it just does it. If you make changes and don't sync them, then run the command, it will yell at you. To relinquish your hold, you need to either sync those changes or discard them by closing out of the project. Here, it asks if we want to sync, save the local copy without syncing, or just close without saving. We'll do the last one. Then you see it asks what to do about the elements and work sets we're borrowing. If you're just closing the project temporarily and you're going to jump right back in, you'll probably want to keep ownership. Otherwise, you can relinquish at this point, which will discard any unsaved changes and free those things up for your coworkers. Last thing to show related to worksets, which I alluded to before, when you open a Workshared project, you can choose to only open certain worksets. So if all of the MEP folks are in one model, but you just need your discipline, you can choose to not open the other disciplines to reduce your chances of accidentally messing with their stuff. If you have a very dense project, you can also choose to not load certain work sets to make Revit process faster. For a project on your network, run the open command, select the project, then use this drop-down beside the open button to select work sets. You can choose all of them, work sets for which you still have ownership, your last active work set, or you can select from a list. For cloud projects, go to the settings on the right, and we have a similar list for all work sets you own, and specify. You might notice this is the same UI as the Worksets command in the project, just with most of the controls disabled. The opened column shows which worksets will be loaded when you open the project. To toggle that, select the worksets and press the close button. Then press OK to open the project. As you can see, only the opened worksets are visible. If we run the Worksets command, you can see which ones are opened, and the open and close buttons are also available here if you need to swap out while you have the project open. Moving away from work sharing, next we're going to talk about phasing. Oftentimes, especially if you are working on an existing building, the project will have interim states for demolition, temporary MEP arrangements while new stuff gets built, and so on until you reach the final product. Revit lets you model each of those phases within a single project. One big thing to note, at time of filming, phasing only really works in terms of whether elements exist in the model. You're essentially just altering visibility settings for specific elements. If you have a duct or pipe that is staying in the same place, but the width is changing, if you're replacing mechanical or electrical devices in the same location, or relocating a device but keeping the same connections, if you're recircuiting electrical stuff, none of that really works here. If you intend to use Revit's phasing features, you will need to find workarounds for those kinds of changes. Also, schedules, reports, and connections will only reflect the final phase. So if you have ducts or pipes or electrical devices that you've flagged for demolition, but you need to see how they affect calculations in those interim phases, that is not supported and you will need to figure something else out. Having said that, I will show you the basics of how it functions in case you want to try it out, or if you're in a project where others are using phasing and you need to know how to work within that environment. We'll start by looking at how you use phases, then take a look at modification. Setting phases for elements is essentially the same as setting their work set or other properties. Select one or more elements, and find the parameter in the Properties palette. You have two built-in parameters you can set: the phase when it was built or installed, and when it was demoed, if ever. By default, projects have two phases, new and existing. We'll set two of these as existing, one being demoed with the new construction, and one being added with the new construction. You'll notice the line styles change depending on their phasing, which is relative to the phase being shown in the view. For your view properties, you can set a filter and the active phase. The filters influence how phased elements are displayed, and we'll take a peek at how you can modify those later. For the phase, if we change it from new to existing, you'll notice the new devices are now gone. The linked model and our spaces are also gone, so let's talk about that real quick. Because it's assumed the room layouts and things might change through the phases, spaces only exist in a single phase. So if you're working in a multi-phase project and you need those spaces for scheduling or load analysis, you will need to define those spaces for each phase. As for the linked model, when you change the phase in the view, It pulls information from the phasing of the linked model. The model we've linked is all new construction, so the existing phase was empty. If you ever need to mess with those settings, you can select the linked model, go to Edit Type, and at the bottom is Phase Mapping. You can use that to tell Revit, when I want to view this phase, here is the phase I want shown from the linked model. So that's the basics for setting up phases. Let's dig into modifying them. To do that, go to the Manage ribbon and run the Phases command. Here, you can see the phases defined in the project. More on that in a sec. For phase filters, this modifies the options available for the phase filter parameter on views and what those different filters actually do. These columns correspond to the state of each element. Elements added in the current phase, elements already present from a previous phase, elements being demoed in the current phase, and elements that are being both added and demoed in the same phase. The options in each cell determine what each element will look like, depending on its phase state and the selected filter. By category will just look normal. Not displayed will not be visible. Overridden will use the graphics defined in the Graphic Overrides tab. As you can see, the rows here correspond to those columns for the phase state in the previous tab. By default, New uses heavy black lines, Existing uses medium gray lines, Demo uses black dashed, Temporary uses dark blue dashed. If you want them to look different, here is where you would make that change. Going back to project phases, you can see we have New and Existing. If you need to insert additional phases, use the Before and After buttons to insert a new phase before or after the selected phase. If you need to get rid of phases, whether it's just because you added too many or the project is in progress and you don't need the previous interim states, you can click the number beside a phase, then merge it into the phase before or after it. What's great about this is any elements set to be added or demoed in that phase you're eliminating will automatically be shifted to the phase where it was absorbed. So if we had, say, 2 interim phases here, called out various additions and removals in each phase, then went back and merged phase 2 back into phase 1, we wouldn't need to go back and fix any of those elements that had phase 2 set in properties for addition or demo. Revit will just go ahead and shift them into phase 1. Okay, one last Revit feature to show you, and that's design options. The idea with this feature is you can use it to explore alternative designs within the same project, like different lighting designs or floor layouts. Now, at time of filming, this feature can be even more restrictive than phasing when it comes to MEP. Similar to phasing, it only really pertains to whether certain things exist, so it doesn't work so well for different load balancing, circuiting scenarios, and so on. You are also limited in terms of how elements within design options interact with the main model and with elements in other design options. All that being said, I'll briefly go over how it works, if for no other reason than to save you the time of exploring it yourself to determine if you would want to use it. To set up your design options, you can go to the Manage ribbon and Design Options, or you can go to this icon on the bottom toolbar. To get started, we'll go under Option Set and press the New button, then create a new option as well. The idea is you will select an option to work in, then anything you add to the model will be associated with that option. The main model is, of course, your model as it exists outside of what is in the option set. Finally, this primary marker indicates which of the options within the option set is visible when you are looking at the main model. The primary is also significant in another way that we'll look at in a moment. Adding elements to an option works similar to worksets and phases. You can select an option from the list and press Edit Selected, or you can use the drop-down on the bottom toolbar. One thing you'll notice while working in an option, you cannot select anything outside that option. You can temporarily disable that using this checkbox. Just know that that is what's going on if you're working in an option and you can't select things. Also know that it will recheck that box if you change your selected option. With your option selected, you just insert what you want to insert, and it will be assigned to that option. If we switch to a different option, those elements we just inserted will disappear. We'll insert some stuff in this option, and you can see the visible elements change as we move between the options and the main model. I mentioned earlier that interactions outside of an option set can be tricky. For starters, you cannot connect elements in an option to those in the main model or another option. So you can't have a panel in the main model and try circuiting devices in an option to it, or connect optioned ducts or pipes to a branch that is part of the main model. Also worth noting, I am using Revit 2024, where this no longer appears to be an issue, but in earlier versions, you could not host elements in an option onto elements in the main model. So if you're working in an earlier Revit version and have, say, a wall that's part of the main model, you can't go into a design option and put panels or light fixtures onto that wall. So I mentioned the primary tag has another use beyond determining which option in the option set is visible when you're in the main model. When you've decided which of these options you want to stick with, you can tell Revit to merge everything from that primary option into the main model. To do that, we need to go back into the Design Options command. Before we merge the primary option into the main model, there's the question. What if we don't want the current primary? What if I want to use the other design option? And that is what the Make Primary button is for. Just select the option you want and press the button. A fun little wrinkle, at least at time of filming, while the elements themselves exist in the design option, the tags are technically part of the main model. And if you change which option these devices are in, Revit isn't sure what to do with the tags, so it's just going to delete them. It isn't a huge hassle in this case, but it is one more drawback to using these features, and something to bear in mind if you are using design options and have a lot of tagged elements. Once you have picked the option you want to keep, select the option set, then press the Accept Primary button. As this warning indicates, once you do this, the elements in the primary option will become part of the main model. More importantly, the entire option set gets erased, along with anything not in that primary option. So if we proceed, you'll notice there are no options anymore, and the devices outside of that primary option are now gone. Now we're going to talk a bit about where to find resources for learning more about Revit and for improving upon the features Revit provides. As I've said at the top of these videos, I am definitely not telling you everything there is to know about Revit. You will need to seek out other learning resources to know how to take full advantage of everything Revit has to offer. Fortunately, you have several avenues available for that, some of which I'll briefly point out. First of all, if you ever want to learn more about a specific command, all you need to do is hover over the command and press F1 to open the official Revit documentation for that command. Similarly, if you're in a dialog box or a warning message and want to know more about it, Oftentimes, they'll have a link in the corner that you can click to see the official Revit documentation. So that's great when you have something in your face you want to know more about, but not all questions are so easily answered. What if you want to just know more about how to work in your discipline? Or you have a specific task you are trying to accomplish and you're not even sure which commands to use? What if you're trying to do something and you're not even sure if it's possible in Revit? That is where the greater Revit community comes in. The Autodesk website has its own knowledge base full of user questions and bug reports. If you hit a snag, searching here could be a good place to start. If you can't find a relevant article, you can make your own or try to talk to someone at Autodesk directly. There's also the Autodesk forums, where users can talk to other users and the occasional Revit developer about certain workflows, clarifications on how a feature works, or just things you'd like to see handled better in a future release. Outside the official avenues, search engines will be your best bet to get started. You likely have some experience doing this, considering you're watching these videos, but I'll touch on it quickly just in case. Let's say you want to know more about using Revit's phasing, so we'll search Revit MEP phasing, and you get videos, posts to the Autodesk forums, posts on social media and blogs, plenty of resources. Over time, you can get a feel for the best places to find the content you want, and you can just search those sites specifically, whether it's YouTube for video content, or social media and blog posts, or something else. There's also plenty of dedicated educational resources out there available through one-time purchases or subscriptions. Two examples would be LinkedIn Learning and Udemy. That's far from an exhaustive list, and we don't explicitly endorse those options. That's just two of the bigger names in that sphere. So, last thing. Revit does a lot of great stuff, but it doesn't do everything, and you might take issue with some of their feature implementations. Fortunately, there's a whole world of add-ins out there to pick up where Revit leaves off. Now, we won't look at how to actually install or use any add-ins. Whether you end up using any and which ones you get will depend on your use case and budget. And the installation and setup will also depend on the add-ins you get. I'm mostly pointing out that they exist and how you can find them. I will say that different add-ins will present themselves in Revit differently once you have them installed. Some will add buttons to the add-ins ribbon. Some will add buttons to other ribbons. Some will add entirely new ribbons altogether. I've even seen ones that give you new docked windows on the side. Again, the exact implementation will depend on the add-in, so be sure to consult whatever learning resources are available for that add-in. Similar to learning resources, the best place to start looking for Revit add-ins is through the official Autodesk App Store. There's an application process to have your add-in listed here, so you can reasonably assume anything you find here will run in Revit and probably not be full of malware. If you want to know more about the acceptance criteria, you can check out the Publisher Guide link in the corner. It works like your typical online marketplace. You can browse by the categories on the left or use the search bar. Say you're an electrical engineer who wants better functionality for your one-line diagram. You get a handful of results, including our add-in right at the top. If you don't like what you see through the Autodesk App Store, you can use search engines for this as well. Since we're going outside the official marketplace, I'll include the usual web browsing caveats. Do your homework before you just start downloading and installing programs on your computer, and do not give anyone your personal or payment information unless you know what you're getting. So for this, we'll search for Revit add-in single line. And again, several results for our stuff if that's what you need, as well as offerings from other companies. Your experience looking for add-ins will depend on exactly what you're looking for, and there may not be a perfect fit for what you need. But this is a great way to explore the workflows and tools people have developed to make your Revit experience a little easier. That concludes our Revit Basics series for MEP. If you have specific questions about Revit, I recommend checking out the resources I mentioned previously. Are there any topics you'd like to see us cover in the future? Let us know. If you're an electrical engineer, you can also ask about our video on the basics of electrical design in Revit. And if you want to step up your electrical design game, consider checking out ElectroBIM using the link at the end of this video. We've got tutorials and a free trial to help you get started. Take care.